The clock is running. And so is the money. 5.6 billion in munitions burned in just the first 2 days of Operation Epic Fury, nearly 2 billion a day since. And the Pentagon is now quietly telling Congress what the defense contractors already know. America's most advanced weapons stockpiles are draining faster than anyone publicly admits. THAAD interceptors, 12.7 million per missile, with only 96 manufactured in an entire year. Patriot batteries sitting at quarter capacity before the first bomb dropped. Tomahawk stockpiles already stretched by Ukraine. And here is the real strategic wound hiding beneath the headline numbers. Iran launches a Shahed drone for $26,000, and the United States spends up to $1 million to shoot it down. That is a cost ratio of 106-1. This is not just a war on Iran. This is a live fire audit of the American empire's actual industrial capacity, and the results are not flattering. Defense Secretary Hegseth himself confirmed the military shifted to smaller, cheaper bombs because the premium arsenal was already running short. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz sits choked, oil prices climb, fertilizer shipments for spring planting dry up, and the Penn-Wharton budget model project's total economic damage reaching $210 billion. Northrop Grumman's stock is up, Lockheed is up, and somewhere in the arithmetic of empire, the question is no longer whether America can win this war. It is whether America can afford to keep fighting it. Now let's understand this for what it really is, because the narrative you have been fed, the clean, surgical, triumphant narrative of American air power dismantling a rogue state, is already fraying at the edges. It started fraying on the very first day. The Pentagon burned through $5.6 billion worth of munitions in the first 2 days of its military assault on Iran alone, according to 3 US officials, and that number has only kept climbing. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the first 100 hours of Operation Epic Fury cost the US approximately $3.7 billion, mostly unbudgeted, while congressional sources told US media the war is costing an estimated $1 billion a day, with Republicans privately fearing it is closer to $2 billion. And here is the part that does not make it into the primetime broadcasts. In the first 6 days of the military operation alone, the costs exceeded $11 billion, and the Pentagon is already preparing to appeal to Congress for an additional $50 billion just to replenish what has already been spent. That is not a military operation. That is a fiscal hemorrhage dressed in camouflage. And now, let's talk about the weapons themselves, because this is where the story gets truly uncomfortable for anyone who believes American military supremacy is simply a given. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio stood before the press and acknowledged what military planners have known quietly for years. Iran produces over 100 ballistic missiles a month, compared to the 6 or 7 interceptor missiles that the United States and its allies can build in the same period. Read that again. 100 offensive missiles against 6 or 7 defensive ones. Iran has been building this asymmetric capacity for decades under sanctions, under embargo, under the full weight of American financial pressure. And it kept building. The Pentagon's own budget documents show that each JSSM cruise missile costs roughly $1 million, with plans to purchase only 389 missiles in fiscal year 2026. Meanwhile, footage from US Central Command showed B-52H bombers returning with empty weapons racks. Empty in the opening days of a war that was projected to last 4 to 5 weeks. The Patriot interceptor system, which has become the backbone of air defense across the entire region, is being consumed at a pace that no production line on Earth can currently match. The Pentagon signed a framework agreement with Lockheed Martin in January to quadruple THAAD production over the next 7 years, from 96 to 400 interceptors per year. 7 years. The war has been running for 2 weeks. The math does not work, and Washington knows it. Lockheed reached a deal to expand PAC-3 interceptor production to 2,000 units per year by 2030, but currently only around 600 are delivered annually. And those missiles are key to the Patriot system that has seen heavy combat use in both Ukraine and now across the entire Middle East. This is the inheritance of 2 decades of decision-making that prioritized procurement contracts over actual industrial capacity. You cannot surge production of a Patriot missile the way you surge production of a cotton t-shirt. These are extraordinarily complex systems built by specialized workers using rare components across supply chains that span continents. There is no emergency button to press. But the situation gets even more strategically alarming when you look at what the United States has been forced to do in response to these pressures. the United States moved one of its critical THAAD, anti-ballistic missile defense systems, from South Korea to the Middle East, a direct sign of the strain that 11 days of strikes have put on US troops and its allies, despite officials publicly downplaying stockpile concerns. The Pentagon also reportedly pulled Patriot interceptor missiles from other regions, including the Indo-Pacific. Think about what that means geopolitically for a moment. The United States has been telling every audience that will listen for the past 3 years that China is the pacing threat. The entire pivot to the Pacific, the AUKUS alliance, the endless reorientation of strategy, all of it premised on the idea that American military assets needed to be concentrated and preserved for a potential confrontation with Beijing. And now, in a matter of days, those assets are being physically relocated from the Korean Peninsula to the Persian Gulf. Defense experts at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies have stated bluntly that the main concern is not having enough munitions for the Iran conflict. It is about the day after and being able to deter China. That is a defense expert saying out loud what the Pentagon is saying in classified briefings. This war is costing America its strategic position in Asia. Seoul is watching this with barely concealed alarm. South Korea's defense ministry acknowledged that while it had expressed opposition to the THAAD redeployment, the reality is that Seoul cannot fully push through its position. There you have it, a formal American ally, one that hosts nearly 30,000 US troops on its soil, watching its primary missile defense shield get picked up and shipped to Bahrain, and all it can do is register a diplomatic objection. That is what the erosion of American credibility looks like from the inside. And while all of this is happening in the Pacific theater, North Korea's Kim Yo-jong has already warned of terrible consequences if Pyongyang feels threatened by ongoing US-South Korean military drills. The pressure points are multiplying faster than Washington can manage them. Now let us go to the Strait of Hormuz, because this is the gravitational center of everything. The Strait of Hormuz facilitates the transit of around 20 million barrels of oil per day, representing roughly 20% of global seaborne oil trade, primarily from producers like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, and Qatar. Since March 1st, the strait has seen traffic drop to virtually zero, with only 78 vessels detected passing through in the first 2 weeks of the conflict, compared to a daily average of over 153 transits before the war began. That is not a disruption, that is a shutdown. Insurance withdrawal is doing the work that a physical blockade has not. The outcome for cargo flow is largely the same, with insurance premiums at 6-year highs, making transit economically unviable for most operators. You do not need to sink ships when you can simply make it impossible for anyone to insure them. And while Western tankers sit anchored outside the strait, something extraordinary is happening on the inside. Iran has continued to send large amounts of crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz to China, even as the war has jeopardized broader supplies. At least 11.7 million barrels of crude since the war began on February 28th, all of it headed to China. Iran is selectively closing the strait to its enemies while keeping it open to its allies. On March 5th, the IRGC announced that Iran would keep the Strait of Hormuz closed only to ships from the US, Israel, and their Western allies. This is a geopolitical masterstroke that no mainstream American broadcast will describe as such. Tehran is simultaneously conducting a war, managing an energy embargo against the West, and maintaining its economic lifeline to Beijing. This is not the behavior of a regime in its death throes. This is the behavior of a state that has prepared for exactly this scenario. Meanwhile, Qatar, the country that hosts Al Udeid, the largest US airbase in the Middle East, has been pulled into this vortex in ways that should alarm every American who pays an energy bill. Qatar has declared force majeure on some LNG shipments after an Iranian drone attack, tightening global supplies and raising concerns about Europe's ability to refill depleted gas storage before next winter. Qatar accounts for roughly 20% of the world's LNG supply. When Qatar shuts down, Europe freezes, and China, the world's largest LNG importer, receives about a quarter of its LNG supply from Qatar. So Beijing, which has been watching this conflict with studied silence, is now watching its own energy supply evaporate in real time. China dispatched its 48th Naval Fleet from its base in Djibouti to the Strait of Hormuz, including the advanced missile destroyer Tangshan, the frigate Duqing, and the supply ship Taihu, coinciding with joint maritime exercises with Iran and Russia. China, Russia, and Iran running naval exercises together in the Persian Gulf, while American destroyers escort oil tankers through a war zone. That is the new geography of power in the 21st century. China holds the largest onshore crude stockpiles in the world, estimated at 1.2 billion barrels as of January 2026, providing approximately 108 days of import cover. and potentially 130 days if Beijing maximized domestic consumption and restricted petroleum product exports. Beijing prepared for this. It accumulated reserves during the period of global oversupply when prices were low. It built the Belt and Road specifically to diversify its energy pathways away from American-controlled choke points. And now, while Washington burns through $2 billion a day in munitions, China is sitting on a year's worth of oil reserves, watching, calculating, and waiting. The talk in Beijing's strategic circles is not panic, it is patience. Back in Washington, the political theater is running at full speed. Trump posted on Truth Social that U.S. munitions stockpiles have never been higher or better, and that wars can be fought forever using medium-grade weapons. The Pentagon, however, had warned Trump before the war began that a prolonged campaign would carry serious risks, and that a lack of critical munitions could hinder efforts to contain Iranian retaliation. A warning that Trump publicly dismissed. The disconnect between the presidential messaging and the operational reality on the ground is a chasm. Former Raytheon executive Wes Creamer flagged as early as mid-2022 that US and European stockpiles were being depleted by weapons transfers to Ukraine, and Northrop Grumman's chief executive had warned that existing stockpiles were not intended to service a lengthy war. That was 4 years ago. The problem was identified, documented, briefed to Congress, and largely ignored while defense contractors collected their profits and production lines ran at peacetime rates. According to the Financial Times, in the first weeks of the campaign, the US used up a volume of precision-guided munitions that would normally last years of operations, with the intensity of fighting far exceeding initial expectations and leading to a sharp increase in the consumption of Tomahawk cruise missiles and air defense interceptors. Years of production consumed in weeks. And replenishing those stocks, as defense analysts keep repeating, is not a matter of months. It is a matter of years. A senior fellow at the Stimson Center told Al Jazeera that the pace of operations in terms of interceptions could not continue for more than several weeks, adding that a Patriot missile or an SM-6 is a very complicated piece of equipment, not something being cranked out hundreds a day. That is the real red line in this conflict, not a geographic boundary, not a diplomatic threshold, but an industrial one. The question is not whether America has the will to fight. The question is whether America has the factories to keep fighting. The International Energy Agency and major consuming nations took the extraordinary step of releasing 400 million barrels from strategic reserves, the largest such intervention in the agency's history, in an attempt to stabilize markets after the war triggered one of the biggest oil supply disruptions on record. The largest strategic reserve release in history, in 2 weeks. While oil prices punched past $100 a barrel and European gas prices surged. The inflation that American families thought was finally behind them is now being recalibrated upward by every energy analyst with a model and a conscience. Half of China's oil imports and nearly 1/3 of its LNG imports transit the Strait of Hormuz. But China is far less exposed than regional rivals like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, which have virtually no domestic crude production and rely almost exclusively on imports. So, in a prolonged conflict, China weathers the storm better than America's closest Asian allies, the very allies that Washington needs to hold together in any future confrontation over Taiwan. The war that was supposed to project American dominance is systematically undermining the alliances that American dominance depends upon. This is the hidden cost that no congressional supplemental budget request can cover. It is not the $50 billion for new missiles. It is the strategic credibility, the accumulated trust of decades of alliances that get spent down alongside the Tomahawk stockpiles. Every THAAD battery relocated from Seoul to the Gulf is a message to Kim Jong-un. Every Patriot interceptor shipped from Asia to Bahrain is a message to Beijing. And the message is not the one Washington intends to send. The empire is not projecting strength. It is revealing in live broadcast the gap between its military ambitions and its industrial foundations. And the world, from Beijing to Moscow to Tehran to Riyadh, is watching every single frame.